The first slip of paper looked almost harmless, tucked neatly into the crack of the front door, as if it were no different from the countless flyers and advertisements the wind often carried to the neighborhood. But unlike a pizza coupon or a landscaping service ad, this notice bore the unforgiving letterhead of the Homeowners Association. The sharp black type at the top practically shouted its intent, a warning to those who dared to deviate from the uniform perfection demanded by the community's board. The letter was short, efficient, and disturbingly clear. It stated that the homeowner was in violation of Section 14B of the HOA covenant, a vague line about unauthorized modifications visible from the street. The offense? A garden tool rack leaned against the garage wall, barely visible from the sidewalk. A minor convenience, placed temporarily, yet now declared a punishable act. At the bottom of the notice, in bold type, sat the threat: a $50 fine, repeated daily until the violation was resolved. The sum at first glance felt trivial. $50 could vanish easily into groceries, gas, or a casual dinner out. But the true danger of the fine was in its persistence. Each day added another cut, small yet sharp, until the numbers stacked high and dangerous. The first thought was disbelief, the second frustration, and the third a chilling realization of what unchecked fines could become over time. The HOA, after all, thrived on enforcement. Each member of the board, self-appointed guardians of suburban order, relished their power. The association existed not merely to keep lawns trimmed or mailboxes painted, but to control. To remind every resident that the community belonged not to individuals, but to the collective will, managed and directed by those seated comfortably at folding tables during monthly meetings. Days passed, and with them, more letters arrived. The first fine was joined by a second, then a third. The total rose swiftly, like water climbing the walls of a sinking ship. 150, 200, 300. The punishment grew out of proportion to the crime, yet the board never blinked. To them, it was simple math. Each day of non-compliance was another line in the ledger, another drop in their coffers. Neighbors began to notice the frequent visits from the HOA's compliance officer, a retired man whose daily hobby had become walking the streets with a clipboard, jotting infractions with the self-importance of a judge. His presence lingered, a constant reminder that no detail went unseen. Residents whispered about his zeal, about how he took pride in escalating minor inconveniences into formal complaints. The tool rack was now a subject of gossip, though many admitted in hushed tones they too had items in their yards or porches that could easily fall under the vague wording of the covenant. The fines became a shadow hanging over the house, creeping into every thought. Ignoring them was impossible. Paying them was even worse. The bank account shrank under ordinary expenses, leaving no room for frivolous penalties imposed by neighbors in positions of power. Something had to change. Something had to be done to break free from the tightening noose of the HOA. It was in this moment of quiet desperation that a spark of defiance flickered. If the fines would grow daily, then a countermeasure had to be equally persistent. It wasn't enough to cover the cost once. A system was needed to generate funds to fight back against the steady march of penalties. Inspiration arrived from the very heart of the neighborhood itself. The unused garages, the cluttered attics, the forgotten basements filled with items collecting dust. Every home held things of little value to one person, yet potentially desirable to another. Old furniture, vintage toys, tools, clothing, decorations, a strange ecosystem of unwanted goods hidden behind closed doors. What if those items could be turned into money? What if the community, usually divided by rules and restrictions, could be united, if only for a while, by the simple act of exchange? An auction. The word carried a certain electricity, a mix of entertainment and practicality. It wasn't just a sale, it was a performance, a gathering, a chance for neighbors to come together not under the thumb of the HOA, but in defiance of it. The idea began small, little more than a daydream, but quickly evolved into something tangible. Flyers could be printed. A yard could become the stage. Items could be collected, displayed, and sold to the highest bidder. The money raised could offset the fines, maybe even surpass them. But more than the money, the auction represented resistance. It was a chance to take what the HOA had turned into a punishment and transform it into an opportunity. To turn frustration into laughter, helplessness into action. Each fine demanded $50. Each item sold could erase 1 day's worth of penalties. The plan, however, carried its own risks. The HOA disliked gatherings not sanctioned by the board. Noise, foot traffic, and anything resembling commercial activity were forbidden within the rules. Hosting an auction could, in theory, invite even harsher punishments. Yet the balance of fear had shifted. To remain passive meant drowning under an endless tide of fees. To act boldly meant at least steering the course, even if into rough waters. So preparations began. Boxes were pulled from closets, shelves cleared, forgotten treasures dusted. Neighbors, upon hearing the plan whispered in driveways and over fences, grew intrigued. Some offered their own items for the auction, relieved to clear space while supporting a cause they secretly resented but dared not challenge alone. The community, it seemed, was hungry for something that disrupted the monotony imposed by the board. The first week's fin, had already reached staggering numbers, but the auction promised hope. Handwritten signs were taped to light poles, flyers tucked under doormats, and messages quietly spread through word of mouth. A date was chosen, a Saturday afternoon when most people would be home, when curiosity could draw them out of their houses and into the unfolding event. The day of the auction drew near, and with it came a new tension. Some board members, no doubt, would notice the growing stir. Some neighbors would whisper not out of excitement but concern. And the compliance officer, ever watchful, would likely appear. Yet the momentum could not be stopped. What had begun as a single fine had grown into a movement, small but defiant, built on the idea that no community could survive on fear alone. And so, on a bright morning filled with equal parts dread and anticipation, the first tables were set up, the first items displayed, and the first signs posted. Neighborhood auction. All welcome. The battle with the HOA had begun, not in the boardroom, but in the driveways and yards of the very people it sought to control. The morning of the auction arrived with a strange energy, the kind that lingers in the air before a storm. The driveway, usually a plain strip of concrete leading up to a garage door, had been transformed into a stage of rebellion. Folding tables lined the front yard, borrowed from neighbors or dragged out from basements where they had been gathering dust. Each table held a collection of mismatched items, some gleaming with nostalgia, others worn from years of use. Old lamps with faded shades stood next to stacks of vinyl records. Rusted garden tools leaned beside boxes of children's toys long abandoned. Clothing racks sagged with forgotten fashions, while kitchenware, books, and even framed art pieces waited for new owners. What made the scene extraordinary was not the items themselves, but the gathering they inspired. Neighbors, drawn by curiosity and a subtle undercurrent of defiance, began to trickle in. Some came clutching wallets, ready to bid. Others arrived simply to watch, to be part of something that broke the monotony of rigid HOA order. Children darted between tables, pointing at toys and trinkets. Adults whispered to each other, amused by the spectacle yet cautious, always glancing down the street as though expecting the watchful eyes of the HOA to materialize at any moment. At first, the event carried the atmosphere of a casual yard sale, but as more people arrived, it transformed. The bidding began not with official hammers or auctioneers, but with enthusiastic voices. A simple call of, "I'll give $5," was countered by 10 from across the yard. Soon, laughter mixed with the rising energy of competition. Neighbors outbid each other for old tools, retro games, and quirky home decor. Every item sold felt like a victory, not just for the bidder, but for the cause itself. The first few sales trickled in modestly. A set of mismatched chairs fetched $15, a box of DVDs earned $20. An antique coffee grinder, unused for decades, suddenly became the subject of a heated contest that ended at $40. The cash box, a repurposed shoebox with a slit cut in the lid, began to grow heavier with every sale. Each bill and coin inside represented not only money, but a day's worth of resistance against the HOA's ever-mounting fines. The energy of the auction spread beyond those who attended. Curious onlookers driving through the neighborhood slowed their cars to watch. A few parked and joined, drawn in by the lively atmosphere. The idea of a community auction, simple yet bold, had sparked something in people. It was more than buying and selling. It was a reminder that the neighborhood belonged to its residents, not to the clipboard of a compliance officer. Still, beneath the excitement lay a constant thread of tension. Everyone knew the HOA would not ignore this event. It was only a matter of time before someone from the board arrived, ready to shut it down. The rules against unauthorized gatherings were as clear as they were oppressive. Yet the longer the auction continued, the more the crowd seemed to forget their fear. For the first time in months, perhaps years, the residents felt like they had seized a piece of their community back. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, the tables grew emptier. The first tally of sales showed several $100s earned, enough to cover several days' worth of fines. Cheers rippled through the crowd as word spread. Every bid, every purchase, was celebrated as a blow against the board's relentless grip. Some neighbors even left, only to return minutes later with more items to donate. Their garages, attics, and closets suddenly became treasure troves for the cause. By mid-afternoon, the event had taken on the atmosphere of a festival. Someone brought out a speaker and played music softly in the background. A neighbor with a small food cart offered lemonade and snacks, refusing payment, calling it his donation to the fight. Children set up a small blanket of their own toys, selling them for coins, their laughter ringing above the buzz of bidding. The entire block seemed alive in a way it hadn't in years. But not everyone was pleased. From the far corner of the street, a figure appeared, walking with stiff precision and carrying the familiar weight of authority. The compliance officer. Clipboard in hand, pen at the ready, his expression was one of controlled disdain. He paused at the edge of the gathering, scanning the scene with eyes that saw not joy but violations. His pen scratched against the paper, marking down notes as though each item sold were another crime. A hush fell briefly as Ors noticed him. Whispers ran through the crowd. Tension rising again. Some expected him to call the board immediately, to summon reinforcements, to shut down the auction before it could continue. Yet, perhaps overwhelmed by the sheer number of participants, he did nothing at first. He lingered, watching, clearly unsettled by how many residents were involved. This was no small infraction he could isolate to a single homeowner. This was a movement, with dozens of people openly defying the HOA's control. Still, his presence was a reminder that consequences loomed. For every dollar raised, another fine might be added. For every smile exchanged, another warning letter could soon follow. The HOA thrived on control, and this auction was slipping beyond their grasp. As the sun dipped lower, the shoebox overflowed with cash. The total, when counted, exceeded $1,000. More than enough to cover the fines accrued so far, and still enough left over to prepare for the ones yet to come. The success was undeniable, and the spirit of the neighborhood was rekindled. But the victory was fragile. That evening, as the tables were cleared and the items packed away, a second letter arrived. This one was more severe, not a simple fine, but an official warning of escalating consequences if unauthorized gatherings continued. The HOA, it seemed, had decided to strike back. What had begun as a simple auction had grown into a battle, not just over money but over freedom, community, and the right to live without constant surveillance. The neighbors had tasted unity, but the board was preparing its counterattack. The question now was not whether the auction could raise money. It had already proven that. The question was how long the community could hold together once the HOA turned its full attention toward crushing their rebellion. The neighborhood awoke the next morning to a new atmosphere, one that felt heavier, colder, despite the same sun rising over the roofs and lawns. The joy and unity from the auction still lingered in conversations, whispered across driveways and over fences, but it was now shadowed by the sharp weight of the HOA's official warning. The board, as expected, had not been idle. Where laughter had once echoed, anxiety now crept in. The letter was far more threatening than the earlier fines. It warned of further action, vague but menacing. The phrase, legal escalation, hung in the middle of the page like a noose, though no specifics were offered. The HOA excelled at such wording, not outright declaring lawsuits or liens, but hinting at them, enough to sow doubt and fear. At the bottom of the notice was a chilling line. Continued non-compliance will result in additional penalties, including possible suspension of community privileges. Community privileges, a phrase that sounded harmless yet carried real consequences. The HOA controlled access to the pool, the clubhouse, the parks, even some parking areas. To be suspended meant isolation, exclusion, a mark of shame that the board could wield like a scarlet letter. And while those amenities were small comforts, their removal represented power. It wasn't about water or grass. It was about control. The compliance officer walked the streets that day with renewed vigor, his clipboard filled with notes, his sharp eyes scanning every porch, every hedge, every driveway. Where others saw homes, he saw infractions. He paused often in front of the house that had hosted the auction, his pen scratching angrily against the paper, as if documenting every detail would somehow undo the victory of the day before. His presence wasn't just routine anymore. It was a warning in itself. By afternoon, new notices began to appear on several doors throughout the neighborhood. Not just the auction host, but others who had participated, even those who had donated items or parked slightly off the curb during the event. The HOA had expanded its net, punishing not one, but many. The message was clear. Unity would be met with collective punishment. No one was safe from their reach. The residents reacted with a mixture of fear and defiance. Some, nervous about being singled out, began to retreat. They spoke less openly, moved more cautiously, and quietly put away anything that might draw attention. Others, emboldened by the taste of resistance, grew more determined. They argued that giving in now would only encourage the board further, that strength came not from silence, but from louder defiance. In the middle of this growing tension, another idea began to take shape. The auction had proven successful, but it had also drawn the HOA's wrath. If one event had shaken the board so much, what would happen if there were more? Not just one auction, but a series of gatherings. Not limited to one driveway, but spread throughout the neighborhood. Each event would be harder to police, harder to shut down, harder to punish without punishing everyone. Word spread quietly, carried in whispers and careful conversations. The neighbors began planning new sales, new auctions, even small block parties disguised as casual get-togethers. The HOA had tried to smother the spark, but instead they had fanned the flames. Where once residents had been silent, now they shared stories of their own frustrations, of ridiculous fines, of arbitrary rules, of letters that never seemed to stop. The fines had been a private burden, but the auction had revealed them to be a common enemy. Meanwhile, the fines themselves continued to grow. The original violation, still unresolved, ticked higher each day. The total now stood at thousands, a number too large to pay off with simple savings. It was a debt designed to break spirits, to force submission. Yet, strangely, it only made the rebellion stronger. If the number was already impossible, then what difference did it make if it grew larger? Why stop now when the fight had already been joined? The board, however, escalated further. Within a week, residents received notices about unauthorized signage, a response to the handwritten auction flyers that had been taped to light poles and mailboxes. Another notice condemned lawn damage caused by too many cars parking on the grass during the event. The HOA's reach expanded into every detail they could possibly control, as though they were desperate to reassert dominance. But the neighborhood had grown louder. One evening, a small crowd gathered in the very driveway where the auction had been held. There were no tables this time, no items for sale. Just neighbors standing together, talking openly, sharing frustrations. It wasn't an official meeting, no motions or minutes recorded, but it was more powerful than anything the HOA board could orchestrate in their sterile clubhouse. For once, the community felt like it belonged to the people living in it, not to the ones policing it. The compliance officer appeared again, as expected, scribbling notes, his face tight with disapproval. Yet this time, instead of retreating into silence, the neighbors stared back. Their numbers gave them confidence. He could write as much as he wanted, but he could not erase their unity with his pen. He lingered, uncomfortable, before retreating. That night, as the residents returned to their homes, they knew the board would not stop. More fines would come, more letters, perhaps even legal threats. The HOA had built its power on fear and compliance, and the auction had cracked that foundation. Now the board was scrambling to restore control, but the community had tasted something new: freedom. Still, uncertainty loomed. How far would the HOA go? Would they truly pursue legal action? Could they play liens, strip privileges, or worse? And how many neighbors would remain brave enough to stand when the pressure grew unbearable? The next morning brought another envelope, larger than the others, thicker, heavier. This was no ordinary fine or warning. This was official, stamped and sealed, carrying the unmistakable weight of escalation. Inside, the words confirmed the neighborhood's fears. The board had voted to impose additional penalties, and if the violations continued, the case would be handed over to the HOA's attorneys. The fight was no longer just about fines or gatherings. It was heading toward a courtroom, toward lawyers and judges, toward consequences that stretched far beyond a few dollars a day. The board had made their move, and now the neighborhood had to decide whether to stand together or fracture under the pressure. The battle had grown larger, and the auction had become more than a clever idea. It was now a symbol of defiance, a line in the sand. And the HOA had made it clear they intended to cross it. The letter from the HOA's attorneys changed everything. Until now, the fines had felt like an irritation, painful but still contained within the boundaries of neighborhood politics. With the arrival of legal threats, however, the battle had crossed into a new realm, one where mistakes carried consequences measured not in dollars alone, but in court orders, liens, and reputations. The envelope, thick and heavy with official language, cast a shadow far larger than its physical form. Fear rippled through the neighborhood like a sudden chill. Conversations that once carried the warmth of rebellion now grew tense. Families debated behind closed doors. Was it worth it? Could a fight with the HOA spiral so far out of control that homes themselves were at risk? The covenant's fine print, full of dense legal jargon, gave the board frightening powers. Many wondered if they had pushed too far, if unity could survive when personal stakes grew so high. Yet amid the fear, something remarkable happened. Instead of scattering, the residents began to organize. What had started as whispered conversations and casual gatherings now transformed into deliberate planning. Driveway chats became strategy meetings. Handwritten notes became typed agendas. The people who had once quietly tolerated the HOA's control were now creating a counterforce of their own. It began with a simple realization. The HOA was not some faceless entity. It was made up of neighbors, a handful of board members, a compliance officer, and the occasional lawyer on retainer. Their power came not from numbers, but from intimidation. And if the rest of the neighborhood banded together, their combined strength could outweigh even the most aggressive board. So, one evening, under the soft glow of porch lights, the residents held what they called their real community meeting. Unlike the HOA's official gatherings, there were no formal procedures, no rigid chairs set in rows, no speeches delivered from a raised platform. Instead, people stood in a circle, each given the chance to speak. They shared their stories: absurd fines for trivial issues, arbitrary enforcement of rules, the constant sense of being watched. What had once felt like isolated grievances now merged into a collective narrative of frustration. The auction host, the one who had sparked the movement, became a symbol rather than a target. Neighbors pointed to the overflowing shoebox of cash as proof that their collective will could outmatch the board's control. The HOA's attempt to punish had instead revealed their own vulnerability. Together, the residents crafted a plan. The auctions would continue, but they would expand. Instead of one household hosting, multiple homes would rotate, making it harder for the HOA to target a single address. They would disguise some gatherings as block parties or cookouts, blending commerce with community. At the same time, they would pool a portion of the proceeds into a legal defense fund, prepared for whatever courtroom battles might come. The atmosphere shifted once more, from fear to determination. Neighbors who had never spoken before were now allies. Retired teachers stood beside young parents, longtime residents alongside newcomers, all united by a shared frustration with the board's heavy hand. The neighborhood, once divided by fences and suspicion, began to feel like a true community for the first time. The first of the rotating auctions took place the following weekend. This time, the tables stretched across two adjoining driveways, doubling the size and the crowd. The selection of items grew stranger and more entertaining. Old exercise machines, quirky lawn ornaments, even a vintage typewriter that sparked a surprisingly competitive round of bidding. The energy returned, louder and bolder than before. And once again, the compliance officer appeared. Clipboard in hand, pen scratching furiously, he stood at the edge of the crowd, recording every detail. Yet now, instead of falling silent under his gaze, the neighbors ignored him. Laughter drowned out his disapproval. The sound of bids rising higher and higher pushed back against the scribble of his pen. What could he do against 50 people standing together, refusing to disperse? The HOA responded swiftly, sending out another round of notices the very next day. But this time, something unexpected happened. Instead of trembling under the weight of the letters, residents began comparing them openly. They laughed at the identical wording, the empty threats dressed up in official tone. Some even pinned their notices to their front doors like badges of honor, daring the board to escalate further. What had once been a tool of control had become a symbol of defiance. The legal fund, meanwhile, began to grow. With each auction, a portion of the money was set aside. Neighbors who could not contribute items donated cash instead. A retired attorney who lived quietly on the edge of the neighborhood stepped forward, offering advice. He explained the limits of the HOA's authority, the procedures they would need to follow to enforce their threats, and the ways residents could push back. Knowledge, once hidden behind the board's walls, now flowed freely among the people it sought to control. The board grew restless. At their official meetings, held in the sterile confines of the clubhouse, attendance swelled. Residents who had once avoided the tedious gatherings now filled the chairs, demanding explanations, asking pointed questions, and refusing to be brushed aside. The board members, once comfortable in their positions, now faced a crowd unwilling to remain silent. Every attempt to justify their actions was met with skepticism, every claim of authority challenged by those who had begun to understand the rules for themselves. The auctions became more than fundraisers, they became celebrations. With each sale, the community reaffirmed its unity. Children sold lemonade beside the bidding tables. Musicians brought guitars and played for the crowd. Neighbors shared food, stories, and laughter. What had started as a desperate attempt to pay fines had transformed into a movement that reshaped the very fabric of the neighborhood. Yet beneath the joy, the threat remained. The board still held power. The attorney's letter had not disappeared. The fines, now astronomical, continued to climb on paper, even as the residents treated them like meaningless numbers. The compliance officer, though visibly rattled, never stopped making his rounds. And behind closed doors, the board plotted its next move, desperate to regain the control that had slipped from their hands. The residents knew another storm was coming. They could feel it in the tightness of the letters, in the stiff posture of the board members at meetings, in the lingering presence of the compliance officer. The HOA was preparing to strike harder, to unleash the full extent of its authority, but the neighborhood was no longer afraid. They had found strength in each other, and no letter or threat could erase that. Whatever the board had planned, they would face it together. And when the next escalation came, it would test not only their wallets, but their resolve. The uneasy calm of the united neighborhood did not last long. The HOA board, rattled by the surge of defiance, returned with a vengeance. Their counterattack came not as a single strike, but as a flurry of blows, each letter, notice, and warning crafted to overwhelm, confuse, and divide. The first salvo landed in the form of certified mail delivered to several homes. Unlike the ordinary paper slips left at doors, these letters carried the weight of official seals and required signatures upon receipt. Inside, the tone was more aggressive than ever before. The board claimed that repeated violations now placed the homeowners in breach of contract with the HOA, opening the door for further enforcement measures. The phrase was left deliberately vague, yet ominous enough to spark fresh anxiety. Within days, new rules appeared on the bulletin board near the clubhouse and on the HOA's website. Parking restrictions were tightened, banning overnight street parking entirely. Trash cans were suddenly required to be hidden at all times, even between collection days. Lawn care regulations were amended to demand uniform presentation, though the definition was never clarified. These rules were not written for order. They were weapons, designed to give the board more reasons to fine those who had dared to resist. The compliance officer seized upon the changes with renewed zeal. He stalked the streets daily, jotting notes with manic intensity, his clipboard filling faster than ever. Cars left slightly askew were ticketed. Recycling bins left outside an extra hour earned fines. Even a garden gnome in one yard was cited as unapproved lawn decor. Every small infraction became another line in the HOA's campaign of pressure. The neighborhood felt the squeeze. Conversations that once brimmed with laughter now carried a nervous edge. Some families, already stretched thin by ordinary expenses, worried about how many fines they could endure. Others feared retaliation beyond paper, liens, lawsuits, or worse. For the first time since the auctions began, doubt crept into the rebellion. Yet the defiance did not disappear. Instead, it adapted. The auctions continued, though more carefully. Homes rotated hosting duties, spreading the risk. Some events were disguised as birthday parties or cookouts, with bidding whispered between neighbors while children played nearby. The compliance officer could scribble in his clipboard all he wanted, but he could not erase the growing pile of cash in the community's legal fund. And that fund was needed sooner than expected. A summons arrived at the home of the original auction host. A letter not from the HOA directly, but from their attorneys. The board had filed a claim, demanding payment of all accumulated fines, plus legal fees. The total was staggering, far beyond anything one household could cover alone. The case was scheduled for small claims court within weeks. Panic rippled through the neighborhood. The board had chosen its target carefully. By striking the one who had started it all, they hoped to send a message to everyone else. If the leader could be crushed, the movement would collapse. Fear whispered through the streets. Would anyone stand beside the host when the board dragged them into court? Or would the rebellion wither under legal firepower? But fear gave way to something stronger. The neighbors refused to let one family bear the weight alone. The legal fund, though modest, was opened immediately. Contributions poured in. Cash, checks, even small donations slipped quietly into envelopes and dropped off at doorsteps. A retired paralegal volunteered to organize documents. The attorney who had been offering quiet advice stepped forward more boldly, promising to represent the case pro bono if necessary. The board had expected division. What they got was solidarity. The auctions grew bolder again, fueled by a new sense of urgency. Items once tucked away in attics were now brought forward proudly. A set of antique tools fetched hundreds. A collection of rare coins, donated by an elderly neighbor, sold for even more. The shoebox was replaced by a locked metal box, and then by a small safe, as the community fund swelled far beyond its modest beginnings. At the same time, the residents turned their frustration into visibility. Notices pinned to doors were no longer hidden. They were displayed openly. Some taped them to windows, others framed them as sarcastic decorations. The board's weapons had become the neighborhood's trophies. What was meant to shame now fueled pride. The HOA board, sensing their grip slipping, escalated once again. They called an emergency meeting at the clubhouse, summoning all residents with promises of critical updates. Flyers were distributed, emails sent, and the compliance officer himself walked door to door to ensure attendance. The meeting was unlike any the board had held before. Rows of folding chairs filled the room, not with the usual handful of disinterested residents, but with a crowd that stretched into the hallway. Neighbors who had never bothered to attend now arrived in force, arms crossed, eyes sharp, ready for confrontation. The board members, seated at their long table at the front, looked uneasy under the weight of so many stares. They tried to speak with authority, outlining the supposed dangers of unauthorized gatherings and declining neighborhood standards. They painted the auctions as chaos, claiming property values would plummet if order was not restored. They waved papers, cited rules, and pointed to the covenant as though it were sacred scripture. But the crowd did not sit quietly. One by one, residents spoke up. They told their stories of unfair fines, of harassment over trivial details, of living in fear of letters and notices. They described the joy of the auctions, the unity it had brought, the friendships it had rekindled. They asked pointed questions the board could not answer. Why were fines used as a weapon? Why were rules rewritten overnight? Why was community spirit treated as a violation? The board, unused to resistance, faltered. Their voices wavered. Their arguments sounded hollow against the raw frustration of the people they claimed to represent. For the first time, the balance of power in the room shifted. It was not the board dictating to the residents, but the residents holding the board accountable. Yet victory was not assured. The court date still loomed. The fines still accumulated daily on paper, their numbers growing monstrous. The compliance officer still patrolled, his clipboard filled with ammunition. And the board, humiliated at the meeting, would not surrender easily. The neighborhood had proven its strength, but the real battle was yet to come. It would not be fought on driveways or in auctions, but in a courtroom, under the eye of a judge. The outcome would decide not just one household's fate, but the future of the entire community. And as the residents dispersed from the crowded clubhouse, their voices buzzing with energy and resolve, One thought hung in the air like a promise. If the board wanted a fight, they would get one. The morning of the court date arrived with an eerie quiet. For weeks, the neighborhood had buzzed with energy. Auctions, gatherings, whispered plans, and loud defiance. But as the hour drew near, that energy hardened into resolve. The HOA had chosen this battlefield, dragging the auction host into court over the mountain of fines they claimed were owed. What they expected was silence and submission. What they got was an entire neighborhood united, walking into the courthouse together. It was a sight that startled even the courthouse staff. Dozens of residents filled the benches, shoulder to shoulder, their presence unmistakable. The board members, seated stiffly at the front with their attorney, glanced nervously over their shoulders at the sea of eyes locked on them. For the first time, their power did not feel absolute. The case was called. The names read aloud. The HOA's attorney stood, presenting the board's argument with polished certainty. He listed the fines, the violations, the supposed breaches of contract. He painted the auction as reckless, disruptive, and damaging to the neighborhood's image. He spoke of rules and covenants, of obligations and responsibilities, wielding the HOA's documents like weapons. The total demanded was astronomical, a figure that had grown monstrous with each passing day. But when it came time for the defense, something shifted. The auction host did not stand alone. The retired attorney from the neighborhood rose beside them, calm and steady. With careful words, he dismantled the HOA's case. He pointed out the vagueness of the cited rules, the inconsistency of their enforcement, the lack of due process in the board's escalating punishments. He argued that the fines were not tools of order, but instruments of intimidation, designed to silence rather than to protect. Then came the testimonies. One by one, neighbors stepped forward. They described the joy of the auctions, the sense of community they had brought, the relief of turning clutter into connection. They spoke of harassment, of letters pinned to doors like threats, of rules rewritten overnight to serve as weapons. They told the judge how the HOA's actions had divided and frightened the community, and how the auctions had restored something far more valuable than money: unity. The courtroom, usually a sterile place of legal procking, became a stage for truth. The judge listened, expression unreadable, as the HOA's narrative crumbled under the weight of collective voices. What was meant to be a simple case of fines had become a referendum on the board's abuse of power. When the judge finally spoke, the room fell silent. The ruling was clear. The fines were unenforceable as written, the HOA's process was flawed, and the demand for payment was denied. The board, once so certain of victory, sat stunned. Their attempt to crush defiance had backfired in the most public way possible. A murmur spread through the crowd, growing into quiet applause, then louder cheers, until the courtroom echoed with the sound of triumph. The residents had not just won the case. They had won their freedom from the board's tyranny. The mountain of fines, once an impossible burden, dissolved into nothing with the stroke of a gavel. But the story did not end at the courthouse. The victory carried back into the neighborhood, transforming the streets into something new. The auctions, once acts of rebellion, became traditions. No longer held in secret or disguised as parties, they were celebrated openly, with banners, music, and laughter. The compliance officer, once feared, now walked the streets with his clipboard ignored, his scribbles powerless against a community that no longer bowed to his authority. The board itself fractured. Some members resigned, unable to withstand the pressure of a neighborhood that no longer supported them. Others faced recall petitions, their names whispered with disapproval instead of respect. In their place, new leaders emerged, residents chosen not for their desire to control, but for their willingness to listen. The HOA did not disappear, but it changed. It became what it was always supposed to be, a group serving the community, not ruling over it. The auctions grew into more than fundraisers. They became celebrations of resilience. Neighbors donated items not because they had to, but because they wanted to share, to give, to laugh together. What began as a desperate attempt to pay fines had blossomed into an annual festival that defined the neighborhood's identity. People from outside the community even came to visit, curious about the street that had stood up to its own HOA and won. The original auction host, once the target of punishment, became a quiet hero. Their driveway, where it all began, remained a symbol of defiance. Every year, the first auction of the season was held there, a reminder of the battle fought and the victory earned. The story spread beyond the neighborhood. Other communities heard about the auctions, the unity, the courtroom showdown. Whispers grew into headlines. Videos of the celebrations appeared online, inspiring people in other HOA-controlled neighborhoods to question their own boards, to push back, to find their own ways of reclaiming power. The HOA had wanted to bury one family under the weight of fines. Instead, they had planted the seed of a movement. And as the sun set on another auction day months later, the sound of laughter, bidding, and music filling the air, the neighborhood stood stronger than ever. What was once fear had become pride. What was once punishment had become tradition. The fines, the letters, the threats, they were now nothing more than stories, reminders of a time when the board thought it could control everything. The neighborhood had proven otherwise. It turned out that no rule book, no fine, no attorney letter could defeat a community that chose to stand together. And it all began with a single auction, a shoebox of cash, and the refusal to give in.